Whispers in the ether, the genesis of Venona. Picture, if you will, a nondescript brick building in Arlington, Virginia. Winter of 1943. Snow dusts the windowsills of what was once a girls' finishing school, its elegant halls now transformed into something far more clandestine. Behind those frost-etched windows, in rooms that once echoed with the chatter of debutantes, a different kind of conversation unfolds, one conducted entirely in silence. Here, in the converted classrooms of Arlington Hall, men and women in crisp military uniforms and civilian attire bend over tables laden with sheets of seemingly random numbers. 5-digit groups march across page after page in neat columns. 1T467, 89012, 34578. Meaningless to most, but to these dedicated souls, each sequence represents a whisper in the dark, a fragment of someone else's secrets. This is the birthplace of what would become known as the Venona Project, though that name won't emerge for years yet. Tonight, as we settle into this story of codes and ciphers, of patient minds working against impossible odds, we find ourselves at the very beginning of one of the most significant intelligence operations in American history. The year 1943 marked a curious paradox in the Grand Alliance fighting the Axis powers. While American, British, and Soviet forces coordinated their efforts against Nazi Germany, a quieter, more subtle game was already beginning to unfold. The United States had learned, sometimes painfully, that wartime alliances could be complicated. Trust, even among allies, had its limits. Colonel Carter Clark understood this better than most. As the chief of the special branch of the Military Intelligence Service, Clark possessed the kind of analytical mind that saw patterns where others saw chaos. In the early months of 1943, he made a decision that would echo through the decades. A decision born not of paranoia, but of prudent strategic thinking. The Soviet Union, America's ally in the fight against fascism, maintained an extensive diplomatic presence in the United States. Soviet consulates operated in New York, San Francisco, and other major cities. The embassy in Washington buzzed with activity, and from all these locations, encrypted messages flowed back to Moscow in a steady stream. Thousands upon thousands of coded transmissions. Clark's reasoning was elegantly simple. If the war ended and the alliance fractured, if the Soviet Union transformed from ally to adversary, wouldn't America want to understand what those messages had contained? The intercepts themselves were relatively straightforward to collect. Radio signals, after all, traveled through the air for anyone with the proper equipment to capture. But capturing the signals was merely the first step in a journey that would prove far more challenging than anyone initially imagined. The task fell to a remarkable collection of individuals, linguists and mathematicians, former teachers and fresh graduates, each drawn to Arlington Hall by different circumstances, but united by a common thread, an almost obsessive fascination with puzzles. These were people who found genuine joy in the mechanics of problem-solving, who could spend hours contemplating the subtle relationships between symbols and meanings. Gene Grabiel arrived at Arlington Hall in the spring of 1943, a young man with a background in mathematics and a mind perfectly suited to the peculiar demands of cryptanalysis. Tall and soft-spoken, with the kind of methodical temperament that thrived on repetitive, detailed work, Grabiel would become one of the project's most dedicated practitioners. His first encounter with the Soviet messages was humbling. The intercepts arrived as long strings of 5-digit number groups, each group representing an encrypted word or phrase. Unlike the German Enigma traffic that had captured so much attention, these Soviet messages used a completely different encryption system, one based on what cryptanalysts call a one-time pad. In theory, a properly implemented one-time pad creates unbreakable encryption. Each message uses a unique key that appears nowhere else, making mathematical analysis virtually impossible. The sender and receiver each possess identical copies of random number sequences, keys that are used once and then destroyed. Without access to these keys, even the most sophisticated cryptanalytic techniques should prove futile. But Grabiel and his colleagues were about to discover that theory and practice don't always align perfectly. The work environment at Arlington Hall fostered a unique culture of quiet intensity. The converted classrooms maintained their academic atmosphere, but now the lessons being taught were far more consequential than proper etiquette or French conversation. Analysts worked at long tables covered with intercepts, their calculations spreading across sheets of graph paper in intricate patterns of numbers and letters. The process began with the most fundamental question. Were these messages truly random, or did patterns lurk beneath the surface? Random number sequences resist analysis. They offer no foothold for the cryptanalysts' tools. But if the random numbers weren't quite random enough, if shortcuts had been taken in the key generation process, then possibilities emerged. Meredith Gardner joined the effort in early 1944, bringing with him a linguistic background that complemented the mathematical approaches already in use. Where others saw numbers, Gardner saw the ghost of language, the subtle rhythms and structures that persist even through layers of encryption. His specialty was Russian, and he possessed the kind of intuitive feel for the language that allowed him to recognize patterns that might escape purely mathematical analysis. Gardner's approach involved a careful study of message lengths and frequencies. Even encrypted, certain characteristics of the underlying language tend to persist. Russian, like any language, has its own distinctive fingerprint. Common words that appear frequently, grammatical structures that create predictable patterns, even when disguised by encryption. The breakthrough, when it finally came, emerged from the most mundane of observations. By late 1944, the analysts had accumulated thousands of intercepted messages spanning several years. The sheer volume of material began to reveal something unexpected, something that should not have existed if the encryption had been implemented perfectly. Certain number sequences appeared more frequently than pure randomness would suggest. The discovery was subtle, requiring months of patient statistical analysis to confirm. But gradually, unmistakably, patterns emerged from the numerical chaos. Some of the Soviet one-time pads, it appeared, were not quite as one-time as they should have been. Whether due to wartime pressures, manufacturing shortcuts, or simple human error, portions of the key material had been duplicated and reused. This revelation transformed the entire enterprise. What had seemed impossible now became merely extraordinarily difficult. If the same key material had been used for multiple messages, then those messages could be compared against each other. Their differences and similarities analyzed to gradually reveal the underlying structure of both the encryption system and the original text. Gardner began the painstaking process of identifying these duplicate messages, intercepts that shared common key material. The work required extraordinary patience and attention to detail. Each potential match had to be tested through complex mathematical procedures, and false leads far outnumbered genuine discoveries. But slowly, methodically, the first cracks began to appear in the Soviet cipher system. The implications of this work extended far beyond the technical challenge of code breaking. Each decrypted fragment offered a glimpse into Soviet intelligence operations during the war years. Operations that painted a complex picture of espionage, recruitment, and information gathering on American soil. The messages revealed a sophisticated network of contacts and sources, individuals who provided the Soviet Union with information ranging from diplomatic intelligence to industrial secrets. Some appeared to be committed ideological supporters of communism. Others seemed motivated by financial considerations or personal grievances. Still others might have been sharing information without fully understanding its ultimate destination. As 1944 drew to a close, the project remained in its earliest stages. The analysts had proven that the Soviet codes could be broken, at least partially, but the actual process of decryption remained agonizingly slow. Each recovered word or phrase required weeks or months of effort, and complete messages remained tantalizingly out of reach. Yet the foundation had been established. The theoretical framework was in place, the analytical techniques were being refined, and the dedicated team of cryptanalysts was growing more skilled with each passing month. What they had accomplished already represented a remarkable achievement: the penetration of an encryption system that was supposed to be mathematically unbreakable. As winter settled over Arlington Hall once again, the converted classrooms buzzed with quiet activity. The analysts worked late into the evening, their calculations illuminated by desk lamps that cast long shadows across the accumulated intercepts. Outside, the war continued its relentless progression toward victory, but inside these walls, a different kind of battle was being fought. A battle of minds against mathematics, patience against complexity. The men and women of this nascent project understood that their work might not bear fruit for years, if ever. They were planting seeds in intellectual soil that might prove barren, pursuing leads that might ultimately lead nowhere. But they also sensed the potential significance of their efforts, the possibility that these seemingly random numbers might contain secrets that would reshape their understanding of wartime intelligence operations. Jean Grabeel returned each morning to his table of intercepts, adding new calculations to the growing pile of analysis. Meredith Gardner continued his linguistic detective work, searching for the telltale patterns that would reveal Russian text beneath the numerical disguise. Around them, dozens of other analysts pursued their own fragments of the larger puzzle, each contributing pieces to a mosaic that remained frustratingly incomplete. The Venona project was still years away from its most dramatic revelations, still years away from the decryptions that would identify Soviet agents operating at the highest levels of American government. But here, in these quiet rooms, filled with the scratch of pencils and the rustle of paper, the foundation was being laid for one of the most consequential intelligence operations of the 20th century. Tonight, as we begin this journey through the hidden world of Cold War cryptanalysis, we find ourselves witnesses to these earliest moments, when possibility was just beginning to emerge from impossibility, and dedicated minds were taking the first steps toward unlocking secrets that were never meant to be revealed. Chaka, the first cracks, Gardner's breakthrough. And so we turn to Meredith Gardner, a man whose quiet brilliance would soon illuminate the shadows of Soviet espionage in ways that even he could not have imagined. Gardner was not your typical government employee. A linguist by training, with a doctorate from the University of Wisconsin, he possessed something far rarer than academic credentials, an almost supernatural intuition for the hidden patterns that lay beneath the surface of encrypted text. By early 1944, Gardner had been assigned to what the Army Security Agency called the Russian section. The work was methodical, painstaking, and largely fruitless. Day after day, he would sit at his desk, surrounded by sheets of seemingly random numbers, searching for any hint of structure, any whisper of meaning. The Soviet one-time pad system had been designed specifically to prevent exactly what Gardner was attempting. Each message was supposed to be protected by a unique key, used once and then destroyed forever. But Jean Grabeel's discovery had changed everything. Those duplicated key pages, those precious few instances where Soviet cipher clerks had made the fatal error of reusing their encryption, they represented possibility. And Meredith Gardner was precisely the right man to transform possibility into reality. The process Gardner employed was part mathematics, part linguistics, and part pure intuition. He would begin with two messages that Grabeel's team had identified as sharing the same key. When you have two different plain text messages encrypted with identical keys, a cryptanalyst can begin to work backwards, using the differences between the encrypted texts to gradually reveal the underlying structure of both the key and the original messages. It was exhausting work. Gardner would spend hours manipulating columns of numbers, testing hypotheses, building elaborate charts that mapped potential letter frequencies and word patterns. He was searching for what cryptanalysts call cribs, likely words or phrases that might appear in Soviet diplomatic or intelligence traffic. Common Russian words like Moscow or comrade or standard diplomatic formulations. These became his anchors in an ocean of numerical chaos. The breakthrough came on a grey December morning in 1944. Gardner was working with a pair of messages from 1942, two communications that had been transmitted from New York to Moscow using identical key material. He had been puzzling over these particular intercepts for weeks, building and rebuilding his analysis, when suddenly a pattern emerged. It started with a single Russian word, liberal. Gardner had been testing various letter combinations when this word suddenly crystallized out of the numerical fog. And once he had that first word, that first solid foothold in the encrypted text, other words began to follow. Antenna, enormous, liberal. These weren't random diplomatic terms, they were codenames. What Gardner was reading, with growing amazement and concern, was evidence of a Soviet intelligence operation on American soil. These messages weren't diplomatic communications at all. They were intelligence reports, detailed accounts of espionage activities being conducted by Soviet agents operating within the United States. The implications were staggering. Here was documentary proof that the Soviet Union, America's wartime ally, was simultaneously conducting extensive intelligence operations against the United States. The messages spoke of agents in place, of classified information being obtained, of a sophisticated network that had penetrated deep into American institutions. Gardner worked with quiet intensity, expanding his initial breakthrough into longer and longer passages of decrypted text. Each successful decryption revealed new details about Soviet operations. There were references to agents working in government departments, mentions of classified documents being photographed and transmitted to Moscow, discussions of recruitment efforts targeting American citizens with access to sensitive information. One message that Gardner successfully decrypted contained a detailed report about American military production capabilities. Another discussed attempts to penetrate the Manhattan Project, the top-secret American effort to develop atomic weapons. The scope and sophistication of Soviet intelligence gathering was far beyond what American counterintelligence had imagined. But Gardner understood that his work required absolute discretion. The intelligence value of these decryptions was immense, but only if the Soviets remained unaware that their communications were being read. This meant that the circle of people who knew about Gardner's breakthrough had to remain extremely small. Even within Arlington Hall, knowledge of the successful decryptions was restricted to a handful of senior officials. As Gardner continued his work through the winter of 1944 and into 1945, the scope of Soviet espionage activities became increasingly clear. The messages revealed a network that used sophisticated tradecraft, dead drops, coded communications, carefully compartmented operations. Soviet intelligence officers, operating under diplomatic cover, were running agents who had access to some of America's most closely guarded secrets. The codenames that appeared in the decrypted messages became a catalogue of Soviet intelligence assets. Antenna was revealed to be an agent with access to classified information about American military technology. Enormous appeared to be connected to atomic research. Each successful decryption added new pieces to a puzzle that revealed the true scope of Soviet intelligence operations in America. Gardner's methodology evolved as his understanding deepened. He developed new techniques for attacking the one-time pad system when key material had been reused. He created elaborate cross-reference systems that allowed him to compare patterns across multiple messages. His work became the foundation for what would eventually become one of the most successful cryptanalytic programs in American intelligence history. The psychological pressure on Gardner was immense. He was reading the secret communications of America's most important ally, discovering evidence of betrayal and espionage that could reshape the entire relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. Yet he had to maintain absolute secrecy about his discoveries, even as the implications of what he was learning grew more and more significant. By spring 1945, Gardner had successfully decrypted portions of dozens of Soviet messages. The picture that emerged was of a comprehensive intelligence operation that had been running for years. Soviet agents were reporting on American diplomatic initiatives, military capabilities, technological developments, and political decision-making processes. The level of penetration was far deeper than anyone in American intelligence had suspected. The timing of Gardner's breakthrough was particularly significant. As World War II drew to a close, questions about post-war relations between the United States and Soviet Union were becoming increasingly important. American policymakers were debating how to structure the post-war world, how much to trust Soviet intentions, how to balance cooperation with caution in dealing with Stalin's regime. Gardner's decryptions provided a window into Soviet thinking that no American policymaker had ever possessed. Here were the actual communications between Soviet intelligence officers and their headquarters in Moscow. Unfiltered insights into Soviet priorities, methods, and objectives. The intelligence value was extraordinary, but so was the potential for diplomatic catastrophe if the Soviets discovered that their codes had been broken. As Gardner expanded his successful decryptions, he began to see patterns in Soviet intelligence priorities. There was intense focus on American atomic research, detailed reporting on military technology and production capabilities, systematic efforts to understand American political decision-making processes. The Soviets weren't just gathering random intelligence. They were conducting a comprehensive assessment of American capabilities and intentions. The quality of information being reported by Soviet agents was particularly troubling. These weren't marginal figures passing along rumors and speculation. The agents described in Gardner's decryptions clearly had access to highly classified information, detailed technical specifications, advanced knowledge of policy decisions, insights that could only come from sources deep within the American government and military establishment. Gardner understood that his work was creating intelligence that could reshape American understanding of Soviet intentions. But he also knew that this intelligence was extraordinarily fragile. The moment the Soviets suspected that their communications were being read, they would change their encryption systems, and this unprecedented window into Soviet operations would slam shut forever. And so, through those long months of 1944 and early 1945, Meredith Gardner continued his patient, methodical work, transforming columns of numbers into revelations that would ultimately help define the emerging Cold War. Each successful decryption brought new insights and new questions about the true nature of the wartime alliance between America and the Soviet Union. Whispers of treachery, Fuchs and the atomic secrets. Among the decrypted messages that emerged from Gardner's painstaking work, one particular series of communications would prove especially troubling to American intelligence officers. These intercepts, dating from 1944 and 1945, contained references to a Soviet asset whose access to classified information seemed extraordinarily comprehensive. The code name assigned to this individual was Charles, and the nature of the intelligence he was providing would send shockwaves through the highest levels of the American government. The messages referencing Charles painted a picture of systematic, high-level espionage that went far beyond the typical intelligence-gathering operations the Venona decrypts had already revealed. This wasn't someone photographing documents in a State Department office or reporting on political conversations. Charles had access to some of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, secrets that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the post-war world. As Gardner and his colleagues worked through the fragmentary decrypts, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Charles was providing detailed technical information about uranium enrichment processes, metallurgical data about plutonium production, and theoretical calculations related to weapon design. The implications were staggering. Someone with intimate knowledge of the Manhattan Project, someone working at the very heart of America's atomic bomb program, was systematically betraying these secrets to the Soviet Union. The Manhattan Project represented the largest, most expensive, and most secret undertaking in American history. Spread across multiple sites from Los Alamos, New Mexico, to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, to Hanford, Washington, the project employed over 130,000 workers. The security measures were unprecedented. Compartmentalized information, extensive background checks, constant surveillance. And yet, somehow, Soviet intelligence had managed to place an asset with access to the project's most sensitive technical details. The Venona intercepts revealed that Charles was not merely observing and reporting. He was providing specific, actionable intelligence that would allow the Soviets to avoid years of trial and error in their own atomic weapons development. Technical specifications for gas diffusion processes, detailed reports on implosion lens designs, even information about the production rates at various facilities. Each piece of intelligence represented months or years of American research and development, now flowing directly to Moscow. For the analysts at Arlington Hall, the discovery of Charles represented both a triumph and a nightmare. Their cryptanalytic breakthrough had uncovered what was arguably the most damaging espionage operation in American history. But the very sensitivity of this information created an almost impossible dilemma. How could they act on this intelligence without revealing that they had broken Soviet codes? How could they protect American atomic secrets without compromising the Venona project itself? The challenge was compounded by the fragmentary nature of the decrypts. While the messages clearly indicated that Charles had extensive access to Manhattan Project information, they provided limited clues about his actual identity. The Soviet intelligence services were careful to avoid including identifying details in their communications. Charles remained a shadow, a highly placed traitor whose continued access to atomic secrets posed an ongoing threat to American security. As more intercepts were processed and additional fragments decoded, a clearer picture of Charles began to emerge. The technical sophistication of his reports suggested he was likely a scientist or engineer working directly on weapon design. The timing of his communications indicated he had sustained access over an extended period, and the scope of his intelligence suggested he was positioned at one of the project's most sensitive locations, possibly Los Alamos itself. The realization that Soviet intelligence had penetrated the Manhattan Project's inner circle fundamentally changed how American officials viewed their wartime alliance with the Soviet Union. While the two nations were still technically allies in the fight against Nazi Germany, it was becoming increasingly clear that Stalin viewed the United States as a future adversary and was taking concrete steps to ensure Soviet access to American military and technological secrets. The Charles case also highlighted the sophisticated nature of Soviet intelligence operations in the United States. This wasn't opportunistic espionage or casual information gathering. The recruitment and handling of an asset with such extraordinary access required careful planning, secure communication methods, and operational discipline. It suggested that Soviet intelligence services had been thinking strategically about the post-war period long before American officials had begun to question Soviet intentions. For J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, the Venona revelations about atomic espionage represented both an opportunity and a challenge. The Bureau now had evidence of the most serious security breach in American history, but evidence they couldn't fully act upon without compromising the source. Any investigation would need to be conducted with extraordinary care to avoid alerting Soviet intelligence that their codes had been broken. The pressure to identify and neutralize Charles intensified as the war drew to a close and tensions with the Soviet Union began to escalate. American policymakers were increasingly concerned about Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe, about Stalin's commitment to democratic governance in liberated territories, about the future of the wartime alliance. The knowledge that the Soviets were simultaneously stealing American atomic secrets added a new dimension of urgency to these concerns. Meanwhile, at Los Alamos and other Manhattan Project facilities, security officials began implementing additional counterintelligence measures. Background investigations were intensified, access to sensitive information was further restricted, and surveillance of key personnel was expanded. But these measures were necessarily broad and general. Without being able to reveal the specific intelligence from Venona, security officials couldn't target their efforts toward the most likely suspects. The technical nature of the intelligence being provided by Charles also raised troubling questions about the timeline of Soviet atomic weapons development. American officials had initially assumed that the Soviet Union would require many years to develop its own nuclear capability, perhaps a decade or more. But with access to detailed American research data, that timeline could be dramatically shortened. The implications for post-war American foreign policy were profound. As 1945 progressed and the war in Europe ended, the Venona team at Arlington Hall continued their methodical work of identifying and tracking Soviet intelligence operations. But the Charles case had added a new sense of urgency to their efforts. This wasn't just about understanding Soviet espionage capabilities or protecting American diplomatic secrets. This was about preventing the transfer of information that could fundamentally alter the global balance of power. The psychological impact on the analysts working the case was considerable. Many of them had devoted years to supporting the war effort, had worked long hours under difficult conditions to contribute to Allied victory. The discovery that a key ally was simultaneously stealing America's most sensitive secrets created a profound sense of betrayal, and a growing awareness that the post-war world would be far more complex and dangerous than they had anticipated. The fragmentary nature of the Venona decrypts meant that identifying Charles would require patient, methodical investigation. Each new decrypt provided additional pieces of the puzzle: references to meetings, mentions of technical documents, descriptions of intelligence requirements from Moscow. Gradually, these fragments would need to be assembled into a coherent picture that could guide counterintelligence efforts. The challenge was made more difficult by the sophisticated tradecraft employed by Soviet intelligence. Communications were deliberately vague, meetings were arranged through elaborate security procedures, and operational details were compartmentalized to protect sources and methods. The Soviet intelligence services had clearly learned from earlier security failures and had implemented rigorous operational security measures. As the summer of 1945 approached and American atomic weapons neared completion, the race to identify Charles became increasingly urgent. Every day that passed represented another opportunity for critical intelligence to flow to Moscow, another chance for the Soviets to gain insights that could accelerate their own weapons program. The stakes could hardly have been higher, and the pressure on American counterintelligence officials continued to mount. The Charles case would ultimately prove to be one of the most significant counterintelligence challenges in American history, a complex investigation that would test the limits of what was possible without compromising the Venona secret. And as Gardner and his colleagues continued their patient work in the converted schoolhouse at Arlington Hall, they knew they were racing against time to prevent one of the most damaging intelligence breaches of the atomic age. The implications of what they had discovered would reshape American thinking about intelligence, about security, and about the true nature of the emerging Cold War. Rosenberg's web, espionage and its consequences. But the secret world of Venona would soon collide with the very public arena of American justice, and the consequences would reverberate through families, courtrooms, and the national conscience for decades to come. By 1950, the patient work at Arlington Hall had provided the FBI with a roadmap of Soviet espionage operations. The decrypted cables didn't just reveal code names and dead drops. They painted portraits of real people, with real lives, who had made choices that would ultimately destroy them. Among these portraits, none would prove more controversial or more tragic than those of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Julius Rosenberg appeared in the Venona decrypts under the codename Antenna, later changed to Liberal. The cables revealed him as an active recruiter and handler of Soviet agents, a man who had systematically exploited his personal relationships to build an espionage network. His wife, Ethel, appeared more peripherally in the intercepts, but the evidence suggested her knowledge of and participation in her husband's activities. The challenge facing the FBI was immense. The Venona decrypts provided compelling evidence of guilt, but they could never be used directly in court. The very existence of the program remained one of America's most closely guarded secrets. To reveal Venona would alert the Soviets that their supposedly unbreakable codes had been compromised, potentially shutting down years of ongoing intelligence collection. So the Bureau faced a delicate task, building a prosecutable case using only evidence that could be obtained through conventional investigative methods. They needed witnesses who would testify, physical evidence that could be presented in open court, and a narrative that would convince a jury without ever mentioning the secret intercepts that had started the investigation. The break came through David Greenglass, Ethel's younger brother and a machinist who had worked at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. Under intense FBI pressure, Greenglass admitted to passing atomic secrets to the Soviets through Julius. More damaging still, he agreed to testify that his sister had been an active participant in the espionage ring. The arrest of Julius Rosenberg on July 17, 1950, marked the beginning of what would become one of the most controversial legal proceedings in American history. 3 weeks later, Ethel was arrested as well, leaving their 2 young sons, Michael and Robert, to grapple with a reality that would shatter their childhood and haunt them for the rest of their lives. The case that unfolded in federal court in Manhattan during the spring of 1951 was about more than espionage. It was about the fears and anxieties of a nation coming to terms with its new role as a global superpower. The Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, years ahead of American intelligence estimates. The Korean War was raging, and Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist crusade was reaching its peak. In this charged atmosphere, the Rosenberg trial became a lightning rod for broader questions about loyalty, patriotism, and the price of ideological conviction. The prosecution, led by Irving Sapol, painted the defendants as traitors who had stolen America's most precious military secrets and handed them to a hostile foreign power. The defense, meanwhile, argued that the case was built on the testimony of admitted spies seeking to save themselves, and that the Rosenbergs were being scapegoated for the nation's security failures. What the jury and the public never knew was the extent to which the case rested on intelligence that could not be shared. The Venona decrypts had provided the roadmap, but the actual evidence presented in court often felt circumstantial and incomplete. Witnesses contradicted themselves. Physical evidence was sparse, and much of the testimony came from individuals who had already confessed to espionage and were cooperating with the government. Judge Irving Kaufman, who presided over the trial, faced pressures that extended far beyond the courtroom. The case had become a test of American resolve in the face of Soviet espionage. A lenient sentence might be seen as weakness, while excessive punishment could create martyrs for the communist cause. The testimony that sealed the Rosenbergs' fate came largely from family members who had turned against them. David Greenglass described how Julius had recruited him to steal atomic secrets, how Ethel had typed up classified documents, and how the couple had served as the center of a sophisticated espionage network. Ruth Greenglass, David's wife, corroborated much of his testimony, adding details about secret meetings and coded communications. But even as the evidence mounted, questions lingered about the reliability of witnesses who had clear incentives to cooperate with the prosecution. David Greenglass, in particular, had avoided the death penalty by agreeing to testify against his sister and brother-in-law. His testimony was detailed and damning, but it came from a man who was admittedly willing to lie to save his own life. The defense struggled to counter this narrative without access to the classified intelligence that had actually triggered the investigation. They could point to inconsistencies in witness testimony, challenge the reliability of confessed spies, and argue that the Rosenbergs were being prosecuted for their political beliefs rather than their actions. But they could not address the core evidence that had convinced the FBI of their client's guilt, because that evidence remained locked away in the Venona files. On March 29, 1951, after deliberating for less than a day, the jury returned guilty verdicts against both Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, but outside, crowds had gathered, some calling for justice, others protesting what they saw as a politically motivated prosecution. Judge Kaufman's sentencing decision would prove even more controversial than the verdict itself. On April 5th, he sentenced both Julius and Ethel to death, making Ethel the first woman to receive the death penalty for espionage in American history. In his sentencing statement, Kaufman declared that the Rosenbergs' crimes were worse than murder because they had potentially altered the course of history by accelerating Soviet atomic development. The death sentences sent shockwaves through the international community. Supporters of the Rosenbergs organized massive protests, arguing that the punishment was disproportionate to the crime and that Ethel, in particular, had been sentenced to death primarily to pressure her husband into confessing. Critics pointed out that other atomic spies, including Klaus Fuchs in Britain, had received prison sentences rather than execution. For 2 years, as appeals worked their way through the courts, the Rosenbergs sat on death row at Sing Sing prison. They maintained their innocence, refusing offers of clemency in exchange for confessions or cooperation with authorities. Their case became an international cause célèbre, with protests organized from Paris to London to Rome. The children, Michael and Robert, were shuffled between relatives and foster homes, their lives forever altered by decisions their parents had made years earlier. Letters between Julius and Ethel during this period reveal the human cost of their choices, the anguish of parents facing execution while their children grew up without them. President Eisenhower, who took office in January 1953, faced intense pressure to commute the death sentences. Supporters of the Rosenbergs argued that execution would make them martyrs, while opponents insisted that clemency would signal weakness in the face of Soviet espionage. The president ultimately decided that the sentences should stand, believing that the couple could still save themselves by providing information about other Soviet agents. But the Rosenbergs never broke, never confessed, never provided the cooperation that might have saved their lives. Whether this reflected genuine innocence, ideological commitment, or simply the belief that confession would not ultimately save them, remains a matter of historical debate. On June 19, 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed at Sing Sing prison. Julius died first, at 8:04 p.m. Ethel followed minutes later, at 8:16 p.m. They were 35 and 37 years old respectively, leaving behind 2 young sons who would spend the rest of their lives grappling with their parents' legacy. The executions mark the end of the most dramatic chapter of the Rosenberg case, but not the end of the controversy surrounding it. For decades afterward, historians, journalists, and activists would debate whether justice had been served or whether two people had been sacrificed to the paranoia and politics of the early Cold War. What remained hidden, locked away in classified files, was the Venona evidence that had started the investigation. The decrypted Soviet cables that clearly identified Julius as a Soviet agent, the intercepts that revealed the scope of his espionage activities, the intelligence that had convinced the FBI of the couple's guilt. This evidence would remain secret for more than 40 years, leaving the public to judge the case based on incomplete information. The human cost of espionage, as the Rosenberg case so dramatically illustrated, extended far beyond the spies themselves. It touched families, communities, and the broader society that struggled to balance security concerns with principles of justice and due process. In the quiet halls of Arlington Hall, where cryptanalysts continued their patient work with Soviet intercepts, the weight of these consequences was never far from mind. The secrets they uncovered in their converted schoolhouse had the power to destroy lives, to tear apart families, and to reshape the political landscape of a nation. Each breakthrough in their cryptanalytic work brought new intelligence, but also new moral complexities about how that intelligence should be used. And as the Cold War deepened, as the intelligence battle between East and West intensified, the lessons of the Rosenberg case would continue to resonate through the corridors of power, reminding policymakers and intelligence professionals alike that the pursuit of national security always comes with profound human costs. Shadows within, the double agent Weissband. But even as the intelligence community grappled with these moral complexities, even as they sought to learn from the Rosenberg case and its aftermath, they would soon discover that their greatest vulnerability lay not in the targets they pursued, but in the people they trusted most. The revelation would come slowly, methodically, like so many of the cryptanalytic breakthroughs at Arlington Hall. But this discovery would shake the foundation of American counterintelligence in ways that no external threat ever could. His name was William Weissband, and for years he had been one of them. In the bustling corridors of Arlington Hall, among the clicking tabulating machines and the whispered conversations about Soviet intercepts, Weissband moved with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged. He was a linguist, a cryptanalyst, a trusted member of the team that was slowly unraveling the secrets of Soviet intelligence operations. Born in Egypt to Russian parents, Weissband had immigrated to the United States as a young man. His facility with languages, particularly Russian, made him invaluable to the Army Security Agency. When the Venona project began in earnest, when Meredith Gardner and Jean Grabeel started making their first tentative breakthroughs into Soviet cipher systems, Weissband was there. He understood the technical challenges they faced, the painstaking process of frequency analysis and pattern recognition that slowly revealed the structure of Soviet diplomatic and intelligence traffic. He knew which messages had been successfully decrypted, which Soviet agents had been identified, which operations had been compromised by American cryptanalytic success, and quietly, methodically, he reported it all to Moscow. The scope of Weissband's access was breathtaking in its implications. He wasn't merely observing the Venona project from the periphery, he was embedded within its operational heart. When Gardner made his breakthrough identifying Charles as a Soviet asset within the Manhattan Project, Weissband knew. When the cryptanalysts began connecting codenames to real individuals, building the intelligence picture that would eventually lead to arrests and prosecutions, Weissband was watching. But perhaps most damaging of all, he understood the technical methods that made Venona possible. The discovery that some Soviet one-time pads had been reused, the specific cryptanalytic techniques that exploited these vulnerabilities, the entire methodological foundation that allowed American codebreakers to penetrate what should have been an unbreakable cipher system. This wasn't just intelligence about specific operations or individual agents. This was intelligence about sources and methods, the crown jewels of any cryptanalytic organization. With Weissband's reports, Soviet intelligence could understand not just what the Americans knew, but how they had come to know it. The implications rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. If Moscow understood the technical basis of Venona's success, they could take countermeasures. They could improve their cipher security, eliminate the vulnerabilities that American cryptanalysts were exploiting, effectively blind the intelligence system that had given the United States such unprecedented insight into Soviet operations. But Weissband's betrayal operated on levels that went beyond mere technical compromise. His presence within the Venona project represented a fundamental violation of the trust that made such sensitive work possible. Consider the environment at Arlington Hall during those crucial years of the mid-1940s. The men and women working on Soviet intercepts knew they were handling some of the most sensitive intelligence their nation possessed. They understood that lives, careers, entire intelligence operations hung in the balance of their discretion. They worked in compartmented cells, sharing information only on a strict need-to-know basis. They submitted to extensive background investigations, accepted restrictions on their personal lives and associations, all in service of protecting the secrets they collectively guarded. And yet, one of their own was systematically betraying everything they worked to protect. The psychological impact of this betrayal, when it was finally discovered, would prove as damaging as any technical compromise. How could they trust their colleagues, their methods, their entire institutional framework, when it had been so thoroughly penetrated? Weissband's activities also highlighted the fundamental paradox that lay at the heart of counterintelligence work. The very skills that made him valuable to American cryptanalysis, his linguistic abilities, his understanding of Soviet culture and communication patterns, his analytical mind, were the same skills that made him effective as a Soviet agent. He could evaluate the significance of American breakthroughs because he understood their technical and operational implications. He could identify the most sensitive intelligence because he participated in producing it. He could assess the threat to Soviet operations because he helped create that threat. This wasn't a case of external infiltration, of a foreign agent somehow penetrating American security. This was something far more insidious. A trusted insider who had been systematically exploiting that trust for years. The damage assessment, when it finally came, would be staggering. How many Soviet operations had continued because Moscow knew they were compromised but not yet acted upon? How many agents had escaped detection because their handlers understood the specific methods American counterintelligence was using to track them? But perhaps the most troubling aspect of Weissband's betrayal was how long it went undetected. Year after year, as the Venona project achieved breakthrough after breakthrough, as American cryptanalysts celebrated their successes in penetrating Soviet cipher systems, Weissband continued his double life. He attended the same briefings, participated in the same analytical discussions, shared in the same sense of accomplishment as his colleagues slowly unraveled the structure of Soviet intelligence operations in America. And all the while, he was ensuring that Moscow understood exactly how much their opponents knew. The counterintelligence implications were staggering. If Soviet intelligence understood the scope and methods of American cryptanalytic success, they could feed disinformation through channels they knew were being monitored. They could manipulate American perceptions, create false intelligence pictures, turn the very success of Venona into a weapon against its creators. This was the chess game within the chess game, the shadow war that operated beneath the surface of the already secret world of signals intelligence. Every breakthrough carried the risk of revelation. Every success created new vulnerabilities that adversaries could exploit. The discovery of Weissband's treachery, when it finally came, would emerge through the same methodical processes that had revealed so many other secrets at Arlington Hall. Patterns in intelligence reporting, anomalies in Soviet behavior, the slow accumulation of evidence that pointed toward a fundamental compromise of American cryptanalytic operations. But by then, the damage was done. Years of intelligence had been compromised, operations had been blown. The entire foundation of American signals intelligence success against Soviet targets had been systematically betrayed to the enemy. The human cost was perhaps even more significant. The men and women who had devoted their careers to protecting American secrets, who had sacrificed personal relationships and normal lives in service of their mission, now had to confront the reality that their most sensitive work had been an open book to their adversaries. Jean Grabeel, who had first noticed the anomalies in Soviet cipher traffic that made Venona possible; Meredith Gardner, whose painstaking analytical work had achieved the first major breakthroughs; all the cryptanalysts and linguists and security personnel who had built one of the most successful intelligence operations in American history, now had to question everything they thought they knew. The Wiseband case would become a watershed moment in American counterintelligence thinking. It demonstrated that technical security measures, compartmentalization, background investigations, all the traditional tools of protecting sensitive information, were insufficient against a determined insider threat. It showed that the greatest vulnerabilities often came not from external penetration, but from the betrayal of trust by those granted the highest levels of access. And it highlighted the fundamental challenge that would define counterintelligence work for generations to come: how to maintain the collaboration and information sharing necessary for effective intelligence work, while protecting against the insider threats that could destroy it. The lessons learned from Wiseband's betrayal would influence American intelligence practices for decades. New security protocols, enhanced monitoring systems, more sophisticated approaches to personnel security all emerged from the painful recognition that the enemy within could be more dangerous than any external threat. But perhaps the most lasting impact was psychological: the discovery that one of their own had been systematically betraying their work, their mission, their trust, left scars that would never fully heal. It introduced an element of suspicion, of constant vigilance, that would forever change the culture of American intelligence work. As the full scope of Wiseband's betrayal became clear, as counterintelligence analysts worked to assess the damage and implement new security measures, the broader implications began to emerge. This wasn't just about one compromised operation or one betrayed secret. This was about the fundamental challenge of conducting intelligence work in a world where trust itself had become a weapon. The shadows within, the enemies who wore friendly faces and carried proper credentials, would prove to be the most dangerous adversaries of all. And in the quiet corridors of Arlington Hall, where so many secrets had been revealed and so many mysteries solved, a new mystery emerged, one that would haunt American intelligence for years to come. How many others were there? How many other trusted colleagues, other dedicated professionals, other guardians of America's most sensitive secrets, were actually serving different masters? The question would linger, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, as the Cold War deepened and the stakes continued to rise. Echoes of the past, legacy and reflection. The questions multiplied in the corridors of Arlington Hall like shadows at twilight, each answered mystery revealing three more beneath the surface, each decoded message opening doorways to darker possibilities that stretched beyond the horizon of immediate understanding. The codebreakers who had dedicated their lives to illuminating secrets now found themselves walking through a labyrinth where every solved puzzle cast new shadows, where every breakthrough brought not clarity but deeper complexity. Meredith Gardner would continue his meticulous work for years to come, his patient methodology unchanged by the revelations that had shaken the very foundations of American security. Hour after hour, day after day, he bent over those fragmented messages, teasing meaning from chaos with the same quiet dedication that had first cracked the uncrackable cipher. But something had shifted in the atmosphere around him, a subtle awareness that trust itself had become another code to be carefully deciphered. The Venona project would expand in scope and intensity throughout the 1940s and into the 1950s, drawing more brilliant minds into its secret chambers, recruiting linguists and mathematicians and analysts who possessed the rare combination of intellectual rigor and absolute discretion required for such sensitive work. They came from universities and government agencies, from private industry and military service, united by their commitment to protecting American interests through the patient archaeology of intercepted communications. Yet even as the project grew, even as more messages yielded their secrets and more Soviet operations came into focus, the fundamental questions raised by cases like Wiseband's betrayal remained unanswered. How do you secure the guardians themselves? How do you protect the protectors when the greatest threats emerge not from external enemies, but from the corruption of those entrusted with the most sensitive responsibilities? The psychological impact on the remaining team members was profound but rarely discussed. A quiet erosion of the easy camaraderie that had once characterized their shared mission. Conversations became more guarded, friendships more carefully calibrated. Professional relationships filtered through new layers of necessary suspicion. The very success of their work in exposing Soviet espionage had taught them uncomfortable lessons about human nature and the fragility of institutional trust. Jean Grabeel, who had made those first crucial observations about repeated Soviet cipher keys, continued to refine the techniques that made Venona possible. His methodical approach to pattern recognition became the foundation for increasingly sophisticated analytical methods. His insights into the mathematical vulnerabilities of supposedly perfect encryption systems, opening new avenues for intelligence gathering that would prove invaluable throughout the Cold War era. But Grabeel, too, carried the weight of what they had discovered. The knowledge that their breakthrough had revealed not just enemy operations, but the uncomfortable reality of how deeply those operations had penetrated American society. The atomic secrets, the diplomatic intelligence, the military planning documents, all had flowed steadily eastward through networks that operated with stunning effectiveness for years before Venona exposed their existence. The broader implications of these discoveries rippled outward through the American intelligence community like concentric circles on still water, each revelation forcing fundamental reconsiderations of security protocols and operational assumptions. The FBI intensified its counterintelligence efforts. The military services overhauled their personnel screening procedures. The State Department implemented new safeguards for diplomatic communications and classified policy deliberations. Yet perhaps the most significant impact was psychological rather than procedural. A shift in the American intelligence mindset from the relatively straightforward challenges of wartime operations to the more complex and morally ambiguous requirements of peacetime espionage and counter-espionage. The enemy was no longer clearly defined by uniform and geography, no longer confined to battlefields where the rules of engagement were established by military convention and international law. Instead, the Cold War presented a different kind of conflict, one fought in shadows and silence, where victories and defeats might remain secret for decades, where the most important battles were won or lost in the minds and loyalties of individual human beings who carried their divided allegiances like hidden wounds through their daily professional and personal lives. The Venona project itself became both symbol and instrument of this new reality, a demonstration that patient analytical work could penetrate even the most sophisticated enemy security measures, but also a reminder that such penetration came at considerable cost to the openness and trust that had traditionally characterized American democratic institutions. For decades, the very existence of Venona remained one of America's most closely guarded secrets, known only to a small circle of intelligence professionals and senior government officials who understood both its strategic value and its potential for causing diplomatic and political complications. The knowledge that the United States had successfully broken Soviet encryption systems was too valuable to risk compromising through premature disclosure, too sensitive to discuss even in classified forums where other intelligence matters were routinely debated. This secrecy created its own burden for those who carried the knowledge, a weight of understanding that could never be shared or publicly acknowledged, insights into historical events that could never be used to correct misunderstandings or challenge false narratives that gained currency in academic and journalistic circles. The codebreakers watched as historians debated questions they could have answered, as political controversies raged over issues they could have clarified, as public discourse proceeded without access to crucial information that remained locked away in classified files. The human cost of this necessary secrecy was perhaps most evident in cases like the Rosenberg prosecution, where the inability to reveal the true source of evidence led to legal proceedings that satisfied neither the requirements of justice nor the demands of national security. The prosecutors knew more than they could prove. The defense attorneys argued cases without access to the most relevant information. The public formed opinions based on incomplete understanding of the actual facts. Such complications were inevitable consequences of operating in the shadowy intersection between intelligence gathering and law enforcement, between the requirements of protecting sources and methods and the democratic principle that justice should be both done and seen to be done. The Venona project had provided unprecedented insight into Soviet espionage operations, but translating that insight into effective counterintelligence action required navigating ethical and legal complexities that had no clear precedent in American experience. As the years passed, as the Cold War deepened and the nuclear stakes continued to escalate, the techniques developed for Venona found application in other intelligence challenges. The mathematical approaches pioneered by Gardner and his colleagues, the analytical methodologies refined through years of patient work on Soviet diplomatic and intelligence communications, the security protocols developed in response to cases like Weissband's betrayal, all became part of the expanding toolkit of American intelligence capabilities. Yet the fundamental questions raised by Venona's discoveries remained as relevant as ever, perhaps more so as the scope and complexity of intelligence operations continued to grow. How do democratic societies balance the requirements of security with the principles of openness and accountability? How do intelligence agencies maintain the trust necessary for effective operation while acknowledging the inevitable reality that such trust will sometimes be betrayed by those who seem most deserving of it? The answers, if answers existed, lay not in perfect systems or foolproof procedures, but in the character and dedication of individuals like Meredith Gardner and Jean Grabeel, professionals who understood that their work required not just intellectual brilliance, but moral courage, not just analytical skill, but ethical commitment to principles larger than their own immediate interests or career advancement. In 1995, nearly 50 years after those first breakthrough decryptions, the Venona project was finally declassified, its secrets released to historians and the public who could at last begin to understand the full scope of Soviet espionage operations during the 1940s and the remarkable American intelligence achievement that had exposed them. The revelation transformed historical understanding of the early Cold War period, confirmed suspicions that had lingered for decades, vindicated some controversial prosecutions while raising new questions about others. But perhaps more importantly, the declassification honored the quiet heroism of the men and women who had dedicated their careers to protecting American interests through the patient application of intellectual rigor to seemingly impossible challenges. Their names could finally be spoken, their achievements finally acknowledged, their contribution to national security finally recognized by the democracy they had served with such discretion and dedication. The documents released in 1995 revealed not just the scope of Soviet operations, but the extraordinary quality of American analytical work that had penetrated those operations, the methodical brilliance that had found patterns in apparent randomness, meaning in deliberate confusion, truth in carefully constructed deception. Reading those declassified messages today, one can sense the excitement of discovery that must have accompanied each breakthrough, the satisfaction of minds trained in mathematics and linguistics finally solving puzzles that had seemed beyond human capability. Yet even with declassification, even with public acknowledgement of their achievements, some mysteries remain unsolved. Some questions continue to echo through the corridors of intelligence agencies and academic institutions, where the legacy of Venona continues to influence how we think about espionage and counter-espionage, about loyalty and betrayal, about the eternal human struggle between the desire for knowledge and the necessity of keeping certain knowledge secret. The codebreakers of Arlington Hall had set out to read other people's mail, to penetrate the communication security of a potential adversary, to gain insight into intentions and capabilities that might threaten American interests. What they discovered was far more complex and troubling than they had anticipated, a web of relationships and loyalties that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of democratic society and the reliability of institutional trust. In the end, as we drift towards sleep and dreams, as our own daily puzzles and challenges fade into the gentle darkness of rest and restoration, we might reflect on the enduring human quest for understanding that drove those patient analysts through years of meticulous work, the same curiosity and dedication that continues to motivate those who guard our secrets and seek to penetrate the secrets of others, the same commitment to truth and security that requires both brilliant minds and steadfast character, the same recognition that some knowledge comes with burdens as well as benefits, and that the greatest victories in the shadow world of intelligence are often those that remain forever unsung, like whispered secrets dissolving into the quiet peace of night, like coded messages finally yielding their meaning to patient minds, like the gentle rhythm of breathing that carries us from waking consciousness into the deeper mysteries of sleep and dreams.